Good to see everybody this evening. I'll let everybody know. So you have lesson 5 and lesson 6. I didn't send out another lesson because we still have 2 full lessons that we haven't discussed. So I didn't think it was necessary to send out lesson 7 and confuse everybody. So we will be picking up with lesson 5. So this is God's design for marital intimacy. And I've got some things that I would like to say kind of up front. Maybe a little more than what I've said before, just to kind of get us kicked off and all kind of on the same page. So obviously what we have discussed up to this point, we have had the ability to watch this relationship grow from the attraction phase to the courtship, to the commitment that they have made to one another, and finally to the marriage that we talked about last week. And tonight, with chapter 4 and going into chapter 5, we really reach the climax of the story between the two, and that would be the wedding night. And I guess I feel like this lesson is probably one of the most polarizing. I guess to me, you're probably either been looking forward to this lesson or you've not been looking forward to this lesson. There's probably not a whole lot of middle ground. But regardless, in my opinion, this is one of the most neglected and yet needed passages in all of Scripture. And again, my opinion, but I've become convinced that one of the greatest struggles that face many Christian marriages today is not necessarily the temptation of sexual immorality outside of marriage, although I think that is there. But I believe that it is the fact that many husbands and wives have not learned really to embrace God's design and God's beauty with the design for marriage intimacy. And I think that over the years we have preached over and over again, and rightfully so, about the purity that we need before marriage. We warn and preach against adultery, against pornography, against all kinds of sexual immorality. Again, those things are needed and necessary. But I think that at least in the past, we've spent far less time talking about the positive side of marriage and the intimate relationship that God has designed with the marriage couple. And so one of the things that I'm afraid has happened is when we read about the marital relationship in regards to sexual intimacy, when you get married, you're not signing up for lifelong celibacy, but lifelong monogamy. So I'm going to say that again. When you get married, you're not signing up for lifelong celibacy, but you are for lifelong monogamy. And so this is a gift that God has blessed us with. You know, when we read Proverbs 5, one of the reasons that I included Proverbs 5 and 1 Corinthians 7 within the scriptures for you to read through, and even the questions that we'll talk about in Lesson 5, is because they deal, obviously, with the things that we're going to talk about in Song of Solomon 4 and in 5. But in Proverbs chapter 4, it doesn't just simply say, don't commit adultery. It says, rejoice in the wife of your youth. It says, be exhilarated always with her love. And then Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he says, don't deprive one another willingly, but to give yourselves to one another in love. So I think that unfortunately, many marriages are what I would consider surviving as opposed to flourishing. Many Christian marriages. I think that we're just simply getting by, and we're not flourishing the way that God intends us to do so. And it's kind of interesting. I joke sometimes. I think that, like our phones are listening to us, and like people are knowing what's going on in your life. And obviously, we're in the middle of Song of Solomon, and I've had a couple of articles that have popped up from Fox News just over the last 2 weeks that have been very, very interesting. And they deal with some research that I think illustrates just how real of a problem that this may be, not even just within the church. But according to recent data from the General Social Survey, nearly 1/3 of married Americans reported that they had not been intimate at all during the previous 12 months with their spouse. So 1/3 of marriages admit no marital intimacy within the last 12 months. Now, obviously, statistics aren't going to tell us everything. There are certain things that obviously we're not going to be able to know. Obviously, there's an age factor, there's a health factor, there's a medical factor. There may be legitimate circumstances that obviously we're not aware of. But as a whole, that's a pretty telling number. And it's something that it caught my attention, obviously, with what we're studying. And then this is something that was literally just put out, one of them last week and one of them this week. And so one of the things that they point out is how relationships kind of pull apart, and you kind of grow apart where you ultimately become roommates and not husband and wife. And we talked about this in the very beginning of the class. This is wisdom literature, and I do believe that one of the reasons that this wisdom literature is here is because this is God's design for the marriage relationship. And so I think that it is something that is very, very important. And so, but we all recognize, those of us that are married, those of you that aren't married yet, you'll come to realize life is hard, life is busy. You get busy raising kids, pursuing your careers, trying to make ends meet, trying to pay your bills, and it feels like on a day-to-day basis you're just getting through life. And at some point along the way, then you probably just become roommates that are trying to do these things together. But I think that one of the things that we get from the Song of Solomon is this is not something that we should be embarrassed to talk about. And so I hope that as we go throughout the lesson that this is not something that is going to be embarrassing, because this is something that is God designed. But one of the other things that I want to be very, very careful about tonight is I'm not intentionally trying to say something to make someone feel guilty because of the relationship that you may have with your spouse. I don't know people's situations as far as health, as far as medications, as far as aging. I don't know those circumstances. And so I'm not making blanket statements that this is the way things need to be. But I can tell you that the scriptures are very, very clear when we read Proverbs 5, when we read Song of Solomon chapter 4 and chapter 5, when we read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that the intent for the marriage relationship is that there be an intimate relationship. And so I just want to make that clear from the beginning. And so I think the principle of the matter, regardless of what situation you may have within your relationship, health-wise, medical-wise, whatever, God's intent is for this to be a part of the marriage. So just wanted to say a few of those things as we get going tonight. So the very first thing that I ask you in the opening reflection is, when Christians think about biblical teaching on sexuality, what subjects usually come to mind? Ken?
I think there's a tendency to think about the negative aspects of it, that we should abstain from sexual immorality, fornication, those kinds of things. We don't really think about the positive aspects.
Okay. Who are you pointing at, Norm? Honey?
Purity culture, or the lack thereof, labeling women as Jezebels or whores.
Okay. What else? Did you have your hand up, Jesse?
I can't.
Oh, well, you may have just been scratching your chin.
You're
debating.
MDR, marriage for remarriage,
Yeah.
is often going to be coming up on this stuff.
Yep. And all of these things are true. I think the purity aspect of things is a big one. Modesty is a big one. My dad brought up last week. Obviously, abstinence before marriage, pornography, adultery, sexual immorality, all of these things, like Ken talked about, it's almost like we focus on the don't, and we don't ever focus on the do. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice within the church when we do that, because God's purpose is not merely just to keep people from sexual sin. That's obviously a key aspect for Christians, but his purpose is to lead husbands and wives to a flourishing covenant relationship. From Genesis chapter 2 to Solomon chapter 4, like that's the purpose. And so it is something that we need to be preaching and we need to be teaching about. Anything else on that? So with the word pictures, so the one specifically that I brought up with lesson 5 is really the garden. And I think that this is one of the major word pictures that we see Solomon use within chapter 4 and even chapter 5. And one of the things that you'll notice as we go throughout the book, the garden actually in different chapters has a kind of different overall theme, and something that I think that we need to pull from it, a different kind of imagery. But I think with in particular the garden here, it is used by Solomon to speak, I think, very beautifully, very tastefully of his bride. And, this is chapter 4, maybe one of those that, we like to joke about because of all the descriptions that Solomon gives to his bride, and obviously in terms that we typically wouldn't use today. But I do believe in the context of chapter 4 and the first part of chapter 5 that he is talking about his bride. But I don't think that we need to get bogged down in, as I've mentioned before, in trying to decide, okay, well, what's the pomegranate, what's the spice fountain, and what does this plant represent? We can't get bogged down in that. I think that, again, that's not really the point of the poetry here. And so we need to be able to stand back and be able to see the whole picture of what is being shown here. And when we think of a garden, I mean, I love the images that AI has created for us because I think it helps us understand the beauty. And there's beauty to gardens, and especially if there's fruit there, it's desirable. It's something that you want. And in relation to her being the garden, obviously it's exclusive within the marriage relationship. And he's very careful to protect it. She's been very careful to protect it up until this point. And now he's being very, very careful to protect it as well. Now, though, she's very open about now it's his garden. And now that it is something that she is joyfully sharing with him. And so I think when we think of the garden from that aspect, I think it brings us back to one of the major points from this lesson is that God designs restraint before marriage, but then it's to be a delight in marriage. And I think that's kind of the overarching thing that we see with the garden in chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. So question number 1, consider Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Before physical intimacy is described, the husband expresses admiration, affirmation, and delight in his bride. Why is that significant? And what does it teach about the relationship between emotional intimacy and physical intimacy in God's design for marriage? Honey?
This praise shows that physical desire is connected with admiration, affection, and reassurance.
All right, so there's a connection there between the admiration and the physical intimacy. What else? Norm?
Emotional support is necessary as a foundation before there's any intimacy. Otherwise, it's going to be a false intimacy, whatever. So you've got to lay that foundation in there first.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to describe it. And we've seen this already just with the relationship in general. But whenever you carry the relationship now into the marriage and you have the physical, intimate side of it, there's still this foundational basis of this emotional connection, this comfort that is going to be seen, this emotional security that you see. Obviously, the affection, the appreciation that is displayed here specifically by Solomon. What else? April?
When you take away the emotional aspect of it, the physical part of it is without meaning, and so it turns into something crude and undesirable without the emotional foundation.
Yeah, and I mean I believe this is one of the reasons for the one flesh It's not just in the physical sense, but you literally are becoming one, and that emotional connection is such a huge part of that. I always, at least for the last several years, it's you leave, cleave, and you weave, and so there has to be that connection, that true connection that is going to build the trust and the relationship to where it should be. And I think that when we talk about New Testament passages and the principles that we have with husbands and wives, well, husbands are commanded to love their wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. And so when we think about Christ's love, obviously Christ's love is sacrificial. Christ is tender and compassionate, and he's not selfish. And so this is a huge aspect of it before the physical act ever even takes place, is that connection, the care that is shown with the relationship. All right, question number 2. So consider Song of Solomon chapter 4, verses 12 through 15. The bride is described as a garden locked and a spring sealed. What does this imagery teach about purity and exclusivity before marriage? And once the marriage covenant has been established, how does the meaning of the garden change? And why is something valuable worth protecting? So what's the imagery there of the garden locked or spring sealed? Ken?
I would say it's like she's kept herself purity, set apart for a certain person, and she has not allowed herself to be tainted in any way.
All right, so you have this portrayal of purity, and I think along with that comes the idea of self-control, that she's been able to maintain this purity, and it is, I think, entirely because of the exclusivity of the marriage relationship, and she has been protecting herself for her husband. And obviously we talked about the value in that, and obviously it's something that you would want to protect. What else? Honey?
The locked garden suggests privacy, value, exclusivity, and sexual inaccessibility. I don't think the text itself says that it's specifically before marriage, or that the garden changes meaning only after a wedding.
So you're saying changes after the wedding?
I'm saying it applies both before and after.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that it is an application of before and after the wedding, absolutely. What else? So, go ahead, Miss Shirley.
Constantly, she's fresh, but she's wholesome.
She's fresh and wholesome.
Marriage relationship.
Okay. All right. And obviously, purity is something throughout Scripture that is presented as honorable. And I mean, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4 obviously teaches that marriage is to be held in honor and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. And obviously, after the marriage covenant is established, I think that, and I pointed this out just a little bit ago, but I think it's very interesting in Song of Solomon chapter 4 and verse 16 that the bride invites her husband into his garden. And so she's been protecting this, and now the phrasing is now this is his garden. That's, to me, very reminiscent of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where your body is not your own. And we see that very clearly right here in chapter 4 and verse 16. And so obviously this is something that she has protected for a very specific reason, and now she is sharing it with the one that it has been protected for. And so, obviously, the garden is going to change in that aspect before and after marriage. Anything else? Go ahead, Lena.
I have a question, because I have a hard time sometimes understanding all this stuff. And we're not going into chapter 5, but it's like, come to your garden, eat. Everybody kind of understands. She is inviting him to herself. And then in the beginning of chapter 5, he says, I have come to my garden and I have eaten. But then he says, eat, O friends, drink, yes, drink deeply, O beloved. So at first, at least, the understanding of eating is not actual literal eating, but then he's inviting the friends to this eating. Is it like a change of meaning? Because he's obviously not inviting friends to his wife.
Obviously, yes. And
Just to understand it.
so the way that I would explain the end of chapter 4, in the very beginning of chapter 5, because very quickly the scene changes in chapter 5, just a few verses in. But the way that I would explain it is, this is, it's been leading up to this event, and it is a joyous event. And so with the poetry, you're using terminology that is going to be something that is exciting, something that is joyful. And so that's the way that I would explain that. No, he's not inviting other people into the marriage bed. Daddy?
One of the translations makes that another individual making that last statement. The NET translation calls it the poet to the couple. So he's talking to the couple, but he's also talking to people about enjoying the party itself. But then he says, drink freely, O lovers. And that's the two. That's the Solomon and his bride.
Okay. Honey?
I've always kind of understood it as it's a guy who's experiencing sex for the first time and he goes and talks with his buddies about it. Like, this is awesome. We should do this.
Okay. Any other comments on Norm?
As Randy was talking about, like the English Standard Version rolls that over to like a general principle that comes in at the end of what the man has been talking about. And the principle is that this which has just been described, you out there, lovers, this is the principle. This is what you can look forward to. And then it swiftly goes back to her speaking again in the next verse.
Okay. Andy?
The Apostle Paul, whenever he was talking to the Corinthians about, as he wrote to them in chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he uses that same kind of language like what we're talking about here. And usually what we find from the writers is that they write or speak exactly how the people would understand. And so when we read it, and then in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 2, which he's talking about the church, but the principle here, he says, I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ, which is basically the same thing that we're talking about here in Solomon. So she has been this bride in waiting, if you will, and so she was being presented as this chaste virgin. She's been kept pure this whole time, and then now he's getting to take her as his bride, as his new wife, and then and so that's kind of what I seen there, a good connection.
Okay. Appreciate that. Let's jump on to number 3. So this is Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 through 23. Solomon does more than warn against adultery. He calls husbands to rejoice in, delight in, and be exhilarated by the wife of their youth. What does this passage teach about God's positive design for marital intimacy, and how is that different from simply avoiding sexual immorality? So Proverbs 5, just the first few verses there. Beginning of verse 15, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be yours alone and not your strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind and a grateful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. And so, what does it teach us about the positive design and not just simply avoiding sexual immorality? Honey?
It teaches that faithfulness is not merely avoiding adultery. Spouses should actively delight in one another, which is more positive than simply don't sin.
Yeah, I think that's a huge aspect of it. Obviously, and I think that you do have people that will will say that, biblical sexuality consists primarily of a list of don'ts. Well, I mean, as we've already talked about, here are our list of do's, but there are other aspects to that. And so while avoiding adultery is part of God's design, obviously, as a husband and wife, you still have to maintain a healthy relationship. We've talked about the emotional side of things, but when either the husband or the wife is emotionally distant or unaffectionate or just indifferent in general, then that's not going to make for a very joyful relationship that we see pictured here in Proverbs chapter 5. That's a pretty joyous relationship that is said there. I mean, it says, be exhilarated always with her love. And so, and Paul echoes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that we'll talk about here at the next question. Go ahead, Sam.
This is kind of a more tangential relation, but like in Matthew chapter 12, when Jesus brings up the parable of like the evil spirit in the house, it's like just because you get rid of the evil spirit doesn't mean that you're doing everything to prevent him from coming back with his friends. It's like you need to replace that bad thing with good things. And in this case, there's that shared duty to I guess, maintain the garden between the husband and wife. Like that, in turn, will help alleviate temptation to commit that sexual.
Yeah, and that's a good way of explaining one of the things that I think is a huge point with this lesson. I think that's a good analogy. And so you can't just, within the marriage relationship, ride on the laurels of, well, I've never committed adultery. Okay, well, if you're in this 33% that haven't had intimate relationships with your spouse in 12 months, then you've got problems. Just because you've not committed adultery does not make you in a good standing. And so you can't just not do that and then not participate in the marriage relationship as God intended and everything be okay. Go ahead, Norm.
We have to remember that the value of the relationship, or the value of anything, comes in the purity of that thing. And so the less pure, as in singular focus, single, the one is used a lot. One means single one. There's no, one doesn't mean 2 or 5 or 10. And what 2 or 5 or 10 represents is common, which is lack of value, something that is you can find anywhere in any place. And that's just the opposite of the way this so far has been talked about, the way this relationship has been built. It's all been based on the one.
Okay, I saw a couple other hands over here. Clarissa?
So the idea here in Proverbs is you're continuing to pursue and seek and grow and strengthen that physical attraction and intimacy. And so that's how married couples today should actively be working and communicating and trying to prioritize that when things get busy and hectic or unaligned or whatever the issue be. There can't be shutting down. You got to actively pursue that youthful desire that you had.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we pointed out just in general with the whole book from the second verse to the very last verse is this continued longing, desire for one another. Honey?
I think people sometimes forget that intimacy is not always sexual. It's also emotional, spiritual.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we learned from the way Solomon handles this in the very, very beginning is it's that there is another side to the intimacy as well. Let's go ahead and grab number 4. So this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. So what responsibilities do husbands and wives have toward one another? According to Paul, what is the normal pattern for intimacy in marriage? And under what circumstances does he allow a temporary exception? So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 3, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So the first question there, what's the normal pattern for intimacy in marriage, and under what circumstances does he allow a temporary exception? Honey?
Husbands and wives owe one another mutual care and sexual consideration. Temporary abstinence is allowed by mutual agreement for a limited time and prayer followed by reunion. We're to stress mutuality, not entitlement.
Okay. Not entitlement. I like that. One of the things I have in my notes, marriage is designed around giving rather than demanding. I'll say that again. Marriage is designed around giving rather than demanding. That includes the intimate side of the marriage relationship as well. Norm, go ahead.
The natural state would be togetherness and intimacy, and I think of the phrase "pray without ceasing." It would be similar to that. I mean, you're not continually in prayer, but you're moving from prayer to prayer. You're moving from a spiritual to a physical, to a spiritual to a physical, and back and forth. And it is a without ceasing type of situation. The togetherness and the intimacy is the natural state. You move out of it from time to time for higher spiritual needs or higher physical needs from that standpoint, but it always goes back to the natural state.
Okay. I see another hand. So, with the question I asked, what's the normal pattern for intimacy in marriage? So, what Paul clearly says is that it's got to happen. Unless you agree for a time for it not to happen, but then you got to come back together. And so, again, not saying anything about health reasons or medical reasons or other things, but in general, Paul is very, very clear that there is to be an intimate relationship between the husband and the wife. And I think that one of the principles that we see throughout Scriptures is that you are always looking out for the other person's needs. That's not just in the marriage relationship, that's just being a Christian in general. And so within the marriage relationship, though, both are going to seek the other's good, not their own. And so we're always going to look out for our spouse and their good and their needs. And so he's very, very clear with his warning that couples are not to deprive one another because if you do this for a prolonged period of time and it's not by agreement, obviously there are the potential for temptation. And so there's got to be mutual agreement. It's got to be for a specific purpose. Here it was devoted to prayer, but then they come back together. And so it is not something that is continuing to go on. This exception is temporary, and it is serving a spiritual purpose. This is not the result of punishment. This is not the result of manipulation. This is not the result of resentment or neglect. We don't read that within Scripture. And so you cannot use the intimate relationship as a tool to get back at your spouse. And so I think that the instructions that we see here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it just reinforces what we read here in the Song of Solomon. And again, that is that God intends for marriages to be marked by mutual love and generosity and affection and joyful intimacy. All right, question. Go ahead, Daddy.
The three things here that Paul points out is there must be a mutual consent to do that. As what you said, you don't not one trying to get back at the other. But the second thing is it's really for the purpose of prayer, and so prayer is a very powerful thing in that. And then the next one is it's just a limited, a limited duration.
Yeah. I mean, it's while we read Song of Solomon, we see all this imagery, and it's like, okay, sometimes I'm a little bit confused. There's no ambiguity with what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There's none. And so we should be thankful for that it's very, very clear, and we should have no questions about that. All right, question number 5. So we've got Song of Solomon, Proverbs 5, and 1 Corinthians 7 all present marital intimacy as one of God's good gifts. How does the biblical picture compare with what is often seen or experienced in marriages today, and what can cause a marriage to drift away from God's design? Miss Shirley?
People today don't view marriage in that way anymore.
Okay. So Miss Shirley says that people today don't view marriage in that way.
They're all permissive, They don't save themselves for marriage and after marriage either.
Yep. So they don't save each other for marriage or after marriage. And I think that when we've already discussed the biblical picture of marital intimacy, this should be one of joy, of delight, of exclusivity, and of mutual giving. And as Ms. Shirley just said, that's not the way the world views it. Go ahead, Jesse.
Well, the first part I have to repeat what you just said, but in many marriages today, intimacy can become neglected, routine, selfish, strained, or distorted by the culture's view of sexuality.
Yeah. And so we talked about the little foxes last week. Little foxes can become big foxes whenever you don't take care of them. But there are a lot of things that we can allow to get in the way that would cause our marriages to drift away from God's design. And so we have to be intentional with the things that we do. And I shouldn't say ultimately, one of the reasons why I think that marriages drift is just because of selfishness. And marriage is about service. Being a Christian is about service, serving everyone else but yourself. So is marriage. And so when we make it about us, we can have problems. And so instead of asking the question, how can I bless my spouse, husbands or wives may be asking, why are my needs not being met? Okay, well, that's the wrong attitude. And I think that Scripture calls us to have the opposite attitude. Philippians chapter 2, in particular, verses 3 and 4, we're to consider others more important than ourselves. And all of these passages where it talks about just general Christianity, well, you should apply that to yourself as a husband and as a wife as well. So Philippians 2, verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. And to me, this is a huge aspect of where the world views marriage and the way that we, the Christians, should view marriage, and they're totally different, because in the world, it's me, 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 me. In the Christian relationship, it's you and you. So it's obviously something that is very, very critical to make sure that we are maintaining a Christ-like attitude in our relationship as husband and wife. Go ahead, Norm.
The Bible pattern always starts with agape, which is the doing what is best for the other person. It always starts there. And so we would be wise to in the same way that we apply that principle to other aspects of our life, the way we do things, that we apply that front and center to our most important physical relationship, and that is the husband-wife relationship. You stick with agape and you lead with that, you're never going to get off track, because it's about what the other person is best, what's best for them.
Absolutely. Let's see if we can grab number 6 here before we close. So our culture often treats sex as casual, while some Christians have unintentionally treated it as embarrassing or merely a duty. How do these passages, and the ones that we've discussed there in Song of Solomon, Proverbs, and 1 Corinthians, correct both extremes? And this is a point that that I would like to have made even when we're talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But this idea of it simply being a duty. And I think that this is how some marriages begin because of incorrect teaching, either by parents or friends or somebody in the church, I don't know who, but they have this idea of, well, I have to do this. It's my duty to do this, and I'm going to do it because it is my duty to do this. I've married, now I have to do this. That is not what we read in the Song of Solomon. Not even close. So I think a couple of years ago, we had a class downstairs with the high school on dating, and we were actually discussing some of these things, obviously less than what we're discussing it in here, but these are, and I just pulled a slide, copied it, and pasted it in here. These are a couple of quotes from Christian wives. So I wish that I'd learned more about how beautiful sexuality within marriage is, not just the shame of it outside of marriage, and how that beauty in marriage is intended to be enjoyable, not just a duty. So there's someone that clearly was taught, okay, well, I have to do it because it's my duty. Then the second quote there, I was so embarrassed that I didn't want to look at my husband the next morning. It took me years to realize it was okay to enjoy intimacy. Song of Solomon is so critical for our understanding of this. But when we talk about these two extremes of the casualness of sex, but then also treating it as it's embarrassing or merely a duty, when we talk about Scripture, it rejects both of those extremes, and those are extremes, all right? And so, obviously, the world is going to separate sex from the covenant relationship of marriage and portraying it as something that's just casual or about me or entertainment or just personal fulfillment. And then, again, as we've read there, you've got some Christians that don't understand the joy that should be had with that marriage relationship. Go ahead, Eddie.
I think one of the important things, if we can all remember, that this is a gift from God.
Yeah, when we talk about God's design for marriage, I think the word gift is a good way to describe it. This is something that God has blessed us with. Like, this is something that was designed in the very, very beginning. In Genesis chapter 2, when you've got Adam and Eve, and he tells them that they are going to become one flesh. This is the gift that he has given us as a married couple. And so, obviously, both of these extremes are wrong, and the Bible presents both of them as wrong and something that we need to be reminded of as husband and wife. All right. Appreciate the comments. So, obviously, next week will be the gospel meeting. So, the week following that, we'll pick up with question 7 on lesson 5 and then continue on into lesson 6. Thanks, everybody.